In 1893, the Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani, gave up her throne because the United States was about to take over the islands. In the 1880s, American leaders supported imperialism, where powerful nations control weaker territories through economic, political, or military means. As a result of European competition for global territories, many Americans eventually agreed with the idea of expanding overseas. Three main factors drove American imperialism. First, there was a desire for a strong military. Admiral Alfred T. Mahan believed that America should increase its naval power to keep up with other countries. As a result, the United States became the world's biggest naval force by building sophisticated battleships such as the Maine and the Oregon. Secondly, people wanted to find new markets. In the late 1800s, American farms and factories had advanced technology that led to surplus production beyond what was needed domestically. The United States looked for foreign trade and markets to keep its economy growing. They also needed raw materials for their industries. The third factor was the belief that American culture is superior. Some Americans believed that their Anglo-Saxon heritage made them superior to others, which was a racist belief based on pride. This way of thinking encouraged the belief that it was important to share American culture and Christian religion with other countries. These factors led to American imperialism and influenced the country's actions in acquiring territories overseas and expanding its global influence. William Seward was the Secretary of State during the presidencies of Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. He bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million in 1867. Lawmakers in Congress ridiculed the agreement, calling it Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly. The United States has found the Hawaiian Islands important since the 1790s. American merchants used them as places to stop on their way to China and India. In the 1820s, American missionaries came to the islands and created Christian schools and churches. In the mid-1800s, American-owned sugar plantations were established on the islands and became a major source of wealth, making up about 75% of the island's economy. Plantation owners brought in workers from Japan, Portugal, and China, which reduced the power of native Hawaiians. In 1900, there were 3 times more foreign laborers than native Hawaiians. In 1875, the U.S. allowed Hawaiian sugar to be imported without taxes. This caused Hawaiian sugar production to grow a lot in the next 15 years. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 caused a problem for Hawaiian sugar growers because the duty imposed on their sugar made it face tough competition. The powerful sugar growers in Hawaii asked the United States to take over and make Hawaii a part of their country. The U.S. military set up a naval base at Pearl Harbor in 1887 because they knew Hawaii was important strategically. In that year, white business leaders made King Kalakaua change Hawaii's constitution. This change limited voting rights to only wealthy landowners. In 1891, Queen Liliuokalani became the ruler of Hawaii after her brother Kalakaua. She wanted to give regular Hawaiians the right to vote by creating a new constitution. However, American business interests did not support this idea. American business groups, with the help of U.S. Ambassador John L. Stevens, led a rebellion against the Queen. The planters took over the island and set up a short-term government with Sanford B. Dole, an American businessman, as the leader. President Grover Cleveland refused to annex the Hawaiian Islands unless most Hawaiians were in favor of it. But in 1897, President William McKinley supported annexation. Hawaii became a part of the United States as a territory in 1898. From 1868 to 1878, Cubans fought their initial war for independence against Spain. The rebels didn't win, but their resistance made Spain abolish slavery in 1886. Afterwards, American capitalists invested in sugarcane plantations in Cuba. Sugar was a crucial Cuban export, and the United States was its primary market. The Cuban economy did well when the United States didn't put tariffs on their sugar. But in 1894, when a tax on sugar was introduced, the economy of Cuba fell apart. In 1895, Cubans started a second war for independence. It was led by José Martí, a Cuban poet and journalist who had been living in New York. Martí led a campaign to damage property, specifically sugar plantations owned by Americans, in order to provoke the United States into responding. The rebels asked the United States for help with their cause. Opinions of the American public differed. Some people wanted to help Spain to protect their investments, while others wanted to help the Cuban people gain freedom from Spain, like how the United States gained independence from England. Spain sent General Valeriano Weyler and his army to Cuba in 1896 to bring back peace. Weyler had a strict plan to gather the rural population of central and western Cuba. He put around 300,000 people in concentration camps to stop them from helping the rebels. Sadly, a lot of people experienced hunger and sickness, which resulted in many deaths. The events became well known in the United States, and New York newspapers exaggerated the brutality of the story to gain more readers. Yellow journalism was a type of reporting that exaggerated news to make it more exciting. In 1897, William McKinley became president. Many Americans wanted the U.S. to help the Cuban rebels against Spain. McKinley wanted to solve the crisis peacefully, and he succeeded. As a result, Spain recalled General Weyler, changed their policy on concentration camps, and allowed Cuba to have some self-government. But two more events increased American resentment towards Spain. The Delome letter, written by a Spanish diplomat, insulted President McKinley and criticized his perceived weakness when it was published. Some Americans were upset to hear criticism from a Spanish official, even if they agreed with it. Soon after the letter was published, a bigger event took place. The USS Maine battleship was in Cuba to keep Americans safe and protect their belongings. Unfortunately, it exploded on February 15, 1898, causing the ship to sink and resulting in the death of 260 officers and crew members. The explosion cause was unknown, but newspapers accused Spain of being responsible. The American people demanded war as a response. The United States declared war on Spain on April 20, 1898. The first major battle happened in the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony that had seen many rebellions. In 1898, George Dewey, an American naval commander, led his fleet to Manila Bay and defeated the Spanish fleet. In the following 2 months, American soldiers fought with Filipino rebels, which resulted in the Spanish surrender in August. The American Navy stopped Spanish ships from leaving the harbor of Santiago de Cuba by blockading it. This happened in Cuba. In June 1898, American troops arrived on the island. Among them were the Rough Riders, a group led by Theodore Roosevelt, who played an important part in the Battle of San Juan Hill. Newspapers portrayed Roosevelt as a hero to the American public. The Spanish ships tried to leave the harbor but were unsuccessful, which caused them to surrender on July 25th. Spain quickly agreed to a peace treaty called the Treaty of Paris. The treaty granted Cuba its independence, and Spain gave up Puerto Rico and the Pacific island of Guam to the United States. The U.S. gave Spain $20 million to take control of the Philippine Islands. The Treaty of Paris caused a big argument in the U.S. about imperialism. President McKinley was in favor of it, but important people had different reasons for not wanting annexation. Booker T. Washington believed that it was important to solve race-related issues within the country before dealing with other social problems. On the other hand, Samuel Gompers, a labor leader, was against the treaty because he was worried that Filipino workers would take away jobs from Americans. The treaty was approved by the Senate on February 6, 1899. Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States after the Spanish-American War. In July 1898, American forces came to Puerto Rico. The commanding officer said they were there to protect the Puerto Ricans, but some U.S. military officials treated them badly. They talked to them like they were kids and limited their personal freedoms. Many Puerto Ricans grew to resent the military government due to this treatment. Puerto Rico is important to the United States because it helps them have a presence in the Caribbean and protects a future canal across the Isthmus of Panama. This led Congress to pass the Foraker Act in 1900. This law put an end to the military's control over Puerto Rico and created a civilian government. The President of the United States could choose Puerto Rico's governor and the upper house of its legislature under the act. However, Puerto Ricans could only vote for the members of the lower house. The U.S. had a strong grip on the Puerto Rican population in their governing system. But in 1917, Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship and the ability to vote for both houses of their legislature by Congress. This was a big change in their political position and how they are represented in the American system. After the Spanish-American War, Cuba became formally independent. The U.S. Army stayed in Cuba for 4 years and made sure that everyone knew they were there. They punished anyone who didn't like the fact that the Americans were in charge. The Cuban government created a constitution in 1900. The United States made sure that the Platt Amendment was added to the Constitution. This change restricted Cuba's independence when interacting with other countries and gave the United States certain advantages, such as the ability to interfere in Cuba to keep things under control. Cuba became a U.S. protectorate, which means that the U.S. had some control over its affairs. The U.S. wanted these rights because they had economic interests in Cuba, like the sugar, tobacco, and mining industries. They also invested in railroads and public utilities. The U.S. wanted to keep control and make sure things went well for their businesses in Cuba. Filipinos had been struggling for independence from colonial rule for a long time. They felt angry towards the United States for taking over their islands. Emilio Aguinaldo, a leader of the rebels, believed that the Filipinos were let down by the United States, who had initially backed their fight for independence. The rebels thought that the United States was doing the same thing as Spain by controlling the Filipino people and taking away their freedom. Aguinaldo rebelled against American rule in 1899, and the rebellion lasted for 3 years. The United States won the Philippine-American War. Later, the United States set up a government in the Philippines that was like the one it had created in Cuba. This means that the United States controlled the Philippines and continued to exert its influence over territories acquired during the Spanish-American War. In 1899, many countries, including the United States, wanted to do business in China and sell their products there. China was seen as a big possible market because of its large population and economic potential. John Hay, the Secretary of State, sent some policy statements called the Open Door Notes to other countries' leaders to safeguard its trading interests. The Open Door policy suggested that every country should have equal trading rights in China. It stressed the significance of keeping China's ports accessible and preserving its autonomy. The aim was to stop any nation from having special trading rights in China. Luckily, other nations accepted Hay's suggestions, and China was able to remain independent. Although China was a sovereign nation, several European powers had substantial control over Chinese cities and territories. In 1900, a group called the Boxers in China started a rebellion against Western countries' influence. The Boxers were martial artists who wanted to expel foreigners and bring back Chinese dominance. Soldiers from different nations, including the U.S., worked together to stop the Boxer rebellion. After the Boxers were defeated, the United States sent more open-door notes to prevent other countries from taking over China or interfering with its independence. The open-door policy was created to ensure that every nation had the same economic opportunities in China and to avoid dividing China into separate areas of influence. And William McKinley won the 1900 presidential election by defeating his opponent, William Jennings Bryan, who was against imperialism. The election results indicate that most Americans favored McKinley's imperialistic policies. Before McKinley was reelected, a group called the Anti-Imperialist League was created. It included important people like former President Grover Cleveland, businessman Andrew Carnegie, labor leader Samuel Gompers, social worker Jane Addams, and writer Mark Twain. The Anti-Imperialist League members believed that the United States shouldn't control other nations without their permission, despite their different backgrounds. The Anti-Imperialist League members had their own unique reasons for being against imperialism. Gompers worried that imperialism would cause more competition for jobs among American workers. Carnegie was concerned that imperialism could lead to never-ending wars between the United States and European nations. The League members agreed that it was morally incorrect for the United States to govern other peoples without their consent. The Anti-Imperialist League had important members and was a significant opposition movement, but the results of the 1900 election show that most Americans favored imperialism, which was supported by McKinley. President William McKinley was killed in 1901, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became the president. Roosevelt kept up with the American imperialism policies by using the power of the United States to help solve global issues and advance its own interests. Roosevelt was important in building the Panama Canal. People had been talking about building a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans for a while. This would make it much faster for military and commercial ships to travel between the two oceans. The Isthmus of Panama was a good place for the canal, but there were some political problems. Panama used to be a part of Colombia. However, when Colombia declined to approve the canal, the United States backed Panama's fight for freedom. The United States built the canal in Panama with their permission. The Panama Canal was built from 1904 to 1914, and it was an impressive engineering feat. Many workers were involved, and there were many challenges to overcome. The canal started operating on August 15th, 1914, and was immediately successful. It greatly improved international sea trade. Roosevelt's foreign policy involved increasing American influence in the Caribbean and Central America. In 1904, he added to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 by issuing the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary said that the U.S. could step in to help Latin American countries if it was necessary to protect American businesses. During President Taft's time in 1911, the United States took control of Nicaraguan railroads, banks, and customs duties by arranging loans. This policy was implemented in Nicaragua. Some people criticize this approach as dollar diplomacy. President Roosevelt was very involved in international affairs and worked to resolve conflicts, protect American interests, and establish the United States as a major global power. Woodrow Wilson introduced a new approach to U.S. foreign policy in Latin America during his presidency. This approach was called missionary diplomacy, and it added a moral aspect to the policy. This doctrine stated that the United States could not acknowledge governments that were oppressive, undemocratic, or against U.S. business interests. This policy was designed to encourage countries to establish democratic governments. This policy was put to the test during the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910. The revolution was a rebellion by Mexican peasants and workers against the military dictatorship in their country. There were two new governments formed, and the second one was headed by General Victoriano Huerta. President Wilson didn't support the Huerta government because they came to power through violence. He wanted to intervene. Huerta's officer arrested a few American sailors in Tampico, Mexico, which created an opportunity. The sailors were freed and an apology was given, but President Wilson used the event as a reason to send American troops. The conflict caused the death of 18 Americans and around 200 Mexicans. This almost led to a war between the United States and Mexico. After the Huerta regime fell and Venustiano Carranza became Mexico's new leader, President Wilson removed the troops and acknowledged the Carranza government. Mexico still faced unrest, as rebel leaders like Francisco Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata challenged Carranza's leadership. Villa's supporters killed Americans, which made the United States want to catch Villa. President Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing to capture Villa, either dead or alive, with 15,000 soldiers. However, they were unsuccessful in their attempt to apprehend him. Wilson deployed 150,000 National Guardsmen to the U.S.-Mexico border. The Mexican people became angry because of these actions. In 1916, the U.S. troops fought against Carranza's army. But in 1917, Wilson removed U.S. troops because he was worried about the U.S. getting involved in World War I. In 1917, Mexico created a new constitution that gave the government control over their oil and mineral resources. They also made rules that were strict for foreign investors. The U.S. intervention in Mexico showed how far the country was willing to go to safeguard its economic concerns. In the early 1900s, the U.S. had a few foreign policy goals. These included getting into more foreign markets, making a strong navy to protect its interests overseas, and showing its power in Latin America.